Wait for you guys to get situated here. Thanks for coming out tonight. It looks like we are going to start with some opening statements. And it looks like Ken is going to be starting with those opening statements and presenting some thoughts on why...
This is Scott. I don't care, but I'm reading Scott first.
Oh, I was told that there was a switch.
Oh,
I'll defer to Howard.
Okay, I'm fine. I'll go first.
Okay. Yeah, so just some opening statements clarifying their position on initiative and referendum.
Okay, I'm rather unique in that I served in the legislature 28 years, and I was the only guy that wanted to abolish the initiative and referendum system. And if you want solitude down there, introduce that constitutional amendment. Nobody bothers you. They want to be a long ways away from you. Now, here's what I'm going to say. Here's my divine epiphany. I assume most of you remember 695. When Tim Eyman had the initiative to take the motor vehicle excise tax down from for me it'd be like $250 down to $30 for everybody. So anyway, it passed one day and it did all the signatures. 2 days later I was in the Lake City Lions and different group. And this guy says to me, you know the motor vehicle excise tax was too high. You knew we wanted to reduce it, and you didn't do anything that serves you right. And I said, sir, last year when the Republicans were in control, and I pointed at Ellen, who was on the other side, they passed a bonding issue, said the motor vehicle excise tax was going to build roads for $5 billion, so they didn't have to do the tax increase, and that was, I think, referendum 49, and the public voted for it. Then this year we voted for this, and he stared at me with a blank look. But first he said to me, you know, it's really embarrassing when I collect $1,000 in tax. I sell a car for $50 and I have to collect $1,000 in taxes. And I told him this. Well, he didn't remember. And so I've issued this challenge over and over again. I said, and I pick a year out. And if you can tell me the initiatives we voted on in 2003, referendums, I'll give you $100. If you don't get them all, I want $100. And I've never had a taker. And it reminds me of the thing when my wife says, when you're going to write a check, put it in the checkbook. And so I remember this check. And at the end of the month, she's going through the bills, and she said, where's check such and such? It's not here. What'd you write it for? And I can't remember. And this is a term in poli-sci. We're engaged in delinked serial decision making. Nobody can remember what they did 3 years ago. If you're going to lower your taxes, then it's pretty hard 2 years out to say, and I want to raise teachers' pay. At least when I was a legislator, I had staff, which the public pays for, and they said, well, sir, you did this last year, that means you can't do that this year. And that's just like a wife who would go, oh. And then I said, yeah, you're right, I need to think about this. And then we try and figure around. But what we've ended up being, and I use the analogy of my wife, if the kids and I got together and said, we decided we're going to raise our monthly allowance and we're going to make you manage the house better, so we're going to reduce our monthly contribution. And they said, oh yeah, at the end of the month, Mom, you balance the budget. And then Tim Eyman comes along and he says, well, she saved $1,000 to fix the roof. And they got plenty of extra money. We can reduce our contribution. And then we expect her to have the full refrigerator and We aren't involved in that. We make the spending decisions. I argue, my wife would hand us back the checkbook and said, I'll see you guys later. When you figure out we got to get a system, let me know. So if I talk about this at all, I talk, is this a good governance system?
You're up, Scott.
Well, thank you. I guess there's a lot that I'd like to jump in there, but I'll wait until a little bit further down the road. First of all, thank you all for showing up. It's one of the great pleasures of my job is to travel around the state and talk to people about politics, and it generally makes it a lot better when people actually show up. So thank you for coming tonight. And on a Wednesday night, nonetheless, as my son would say, you guys need to get a life. Talk about the powers of initiative. Thank you to Michael for moderating. Thank you to Chandler and the university and so forth. Well, I love the power of initiative, and I imagine that most of you will go along with me, that you love the power of initiative because of my charm. But for the rest of you, I'll try to give you a few arguments and convince you that the power of initiative is probably the best expression of our form of government, the most pure expression of our form of government. Ken has outlined he doesn't think so, but we will certainly get into that. And I think it's a philosophical question. It's not a legal question. Should citizens be allowed the power of initiative is a policy question. And first, you have to be able to answer a number of questions before you can decide if you like the power of initiative. You have to decide what is a just government? What should it do? What powers should a government have? In other words, how big or how small should it be, and how could you potentially restrain a government that you've created? And you've got to go back, I think, and because we have 10 minutes for an opening statement, I will be like a rock skipping across a pond over 200 years of our history. You've got to go back to 1689 to the rabble in the Sherwood Forts, the English philosopher John Locke. And John Locke outlined in his 3 treatises of government what a just government is. And he outlines the natural law. He says, if you look at nature, all animals are equal. It's inherently apparent that all deer are given the same opportunities as other deer. And we have imbued those words in our Declaration of Independence. John Locke, those threads come through. All men are created equal. And John Locke refuted the divine power of the king. He said, no, the king's not the only person that gets powers from God. We all get the powers. And we said, we are endowed by our Creator. And John Locke, the father of property rights, talked about these ideas that you own your body, and you own your labor, and you own the products of your labor, and that we should be able to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And out of that, he talked about a just government, that a just government derives its power from the consent of the governed, which is fundamental to our form of government. And indeed, 100 years later or so, in the U.S. Constitution, we start out, we the people. In order to form a more perfect union, we echo those ideas that we are giving the consent of the governed. We set up a system of government that creates a tension. It makes it hard to pass laws. It makes it hard for government to grow. That restrains government. We created 3 branches of government: an executive power, legislative power, and a judicial power. And we set this forth, and not merely a year later, we had to restrain government with the Bill of Rights. The 10 ideas that we had to amend immediately to tell government what they couldn't do. And I think about my son. I might leave the house and tell him, tonight for dinner, you can have carrots or peas or broccoli. And I come back and I ask him, Ashok, what have you had for dinner? He says, well, I had a cheeseburger. And I say, well, I told you you could have carrots or broccoli or peas. And he says, but you didn't tell me I couldn't have a cheeseburger. And that's what we did in the Bill of Rights. We told government what they couldn't do. They couldn't infringe on your First Amendment rights. They couldn't infringe on your Second Amendment rights. They couldn't improperly restrain you without due process. And then 100 years later, the Washington comes, and we create a Constitution. I love the preamble to our Constitution, which says, and you'll hear the echoes of John Locke, and you'll hear the echoes of the Declaration in the U.S. Constitution. And it says, "We the people of the state of Washington, grateful to the supreme ruler of the universe." Somehow Washingtonians couldn't say God, but the supreme ruler of the universe for our liberties, do ordain this Constitution. It's a just government. We give the power, some limited power to the government to form it. "But all political power is inherent in the people, and government derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and are established to do what? To protect and maintain individual rights." These property rights, this thought from John Locke. But then, merely a few years later, in 1912, we established the system of citizen initiative. And it's a way to restrain government. It's a way to hold government back. We did, of course, the 3 branches of government, that kind of stuff. But it was lobbied by the Grange to say, there was a populist movement and worried about special interests taking control of our government. So the Grange lobbied and brought into the Constitution the power of citizen initiative. And the power of citizen initiative is in the legislative section of our state constitution, the Green Book that's on the table, and you're all welcome to have it. And it says in there, the first power reserved by the people is what? Initiatives. The citizen initiative, that's the first power. Citizens say, we want to maintain our control and the reins on government. We want to be able to have an opportunity to make laws when the time comes. And we created some fantastic laws through citizen initiative that have restrained government. Things that government would not have passed themselves. Disclosure laws were brought by citizen initiative. Both campaign finance disclosure, how much money the politicians get from people, so that we can see who's funding these folks. That was passed by citizen initiative. The Public Records Act was passed, and I love the Public Records Act. The preamble to the Public Records Act echoes John Locke and the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and our founding fathers. And here's what it says. Public Records Act. The people of the state do not yield their sovereignty to agencies that serve them. The government works for the people don't work for the government. The people in delegating authority do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so they will maintain control over the instruments that they have created. They want to control government. That's what citizen initiative is about. Performance audits, auditing the government, I-900, that was an initiative. And it's interesting to hear some of the language that is used in that. By the way, is someone keeping time? Because I feel like we're doing good still, okay. All right, I just want to make sure. Performance audits, but if you read how those came about, are politicians spending our current tax revenues as cost effectively as possible? Voters don't know because politicians have repeatedly blocked our state auditor from conducting independent, comprehensive performance audits on state and local governments, agencies, programs, and accounts. Currently, Washington is the only state in the nation that prohibits independently elected state auditor from doing the job he or she was hired to do without explicit legislative permission. This measure requires the state auditor to conduct independent, comprehensive performance audits on state and local governments, agencies, programs, and accounts. Something the government wouldn't pass on themselves. The citizens came along and said, we want a more efficient and effective government, and we want to require you to do performance audits, and we passed that by citizen initiative. Lots of good ideas through the times on restraining government so they don't grow beyond their power. Since I have a little bit of time, I thought I would answer the question. Ken brings up a good point. He says, hey, citizens are schizophrenic. One year in 1998, they passed Referendum 49. The next year, they pass I-695, the car tax. And that is in conflict, but I don't see that in conflict. It is not in conflict to say that, first of all, what he doesn't say about Referendum 49 is that Referendum 49 did a couple of things. We were spending car tax on a lot of things other than transportation projects. And so it reeled back in and said, you will spend your money on transportation projects. So it is not in conflict to say that you want to have government be more effective and to reduce taxes. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. And this next, so we'll ask a series of questions. Each of our debaters will have 5 minutes to answer those questions, and we'll rotate who's going first here. So the first question that I would have is a pretty simple question about whether citizens should be allowed to make laws. I would just say a couple things. In political science, we're taught at least to be a little bit skeptical of public opinion, and that when we look at public opinion data, we see that it doesn't appear that the citizens know a great deal about politics. So should we entrust citizens with the capacity to make laws and to understand the complexity of the policy process? So we will start with Scott. Answer that question.
Well, I would say yes, citizens should be able to make laws, and they do, both in the legislature and through citizen initiative. Our legislators are citizens. They are people that are just like you. They have to meet 2 qualifications in this state. They have to be a U.S. citizen, and they have to be a registered voter in the district in which they live. They don't have to have any other special qualifications. But should citizens be allowed to make laws by citizen initiative? I would say absolutely. We have to, in order to maintain and control our government and make sure that it doesn't run beyond its just powers, those to protect individual rights, our property rights. That's the limit of government. We have to be able to control them, otherwise they will grow beyond their means. So I would say yes, citizens both in the legislature and outside by citizen initiative should be allowed to make laws.
Well, I assume the first thing then, you must be awfully unhappy living in the United States because they don't have an initiative and referendum system. And the country's never adopted it, and a lot of states haven't. And I use the analogy, it would be like if Bush is running for president and we collected the signatures that we call the troops from Iraq, and we re-elected George Bush, we'd be the laughingstock of the world. You can't get consistency in our policy. The second thing I think you got to remember is he talks about the Citizens Initiative. There was a Supreme Court decision said you could pay signature gatherers. Before that, it was a volunteer activity. And Tim Eyman, there's a lot of them that would have passed. Don't get me wrong, but it was a lot more restrained. And I'll give you one example that I find so ironical. Martin Selig wanted to do away with the inheritance tax. I can't imagine him in the Edmonds Ferry line on a weekend collecting signatures on that initiative. But he donated $695,000, and there was guys that were homeless getting paid $1.50 to $2 an hour for every signature. And they were out collecting signatures. I've seen people gathering signatures on contradictory issues. But if you're making $1.50 in a signature, if I get you to sign both, I've just made $3. I don't care what they are. I need the money. And if this is citizen involvement, and we've never revisited it since the Supreme Court made that decision. And what I argue is it morphed into a more virulent type of issue where money can buy signature gatherers now. And the other one I'll give you a simple little example from my day, 1983, and I voted for a penny tax increase on sales. And I did it right away. I did what they want. I don't want to make I look profound or anything. But anyway, it happened right away. 2 years later, and I was considered the most marginal member of the legislature because it was a Republican district, and I got elected. I got re-elected. But when I voted for the pop tax, and I put it real simple, ours was a couple billion, but that one was 250 million. It would have been an extra penny on a can of pop. And I can't imagine anybody in this room going out and collecting signatures to repeal a penny on the pop tax. But I think I got my numbers right. The pop industry spent $16 million to beat it. They did a referendum, hired people, and it voted, and the public voted it down because with television, the discussion was around one little point where you might tax, I'm quoting, a food item. And so everybody said, I don't want that taxed. They forgot to tell you on television, it's essentially a pop tax. And so we lost the 250 million. But they didn't want to establish any kind of precedence here that would go to other states. This is a citizen initiative, thanks to the Supreme Court.
Great. The next question is, do legislators like the initiative process? So that might be one way that we measure whether or not this is successful. So if you'd like to take a turn with that question first.
Okay. Well, I obviously decided that if you're going to elect me, I'll make a decision for better or worse. If you don't like my decision, then don't vote for me in 2 years. I call that the Republican form of government. And so then I turn around and I say from that there's a lot. I introduced my abolishment to widen the discussion on this issue. And nobody discusses it because it's become part of the game. And the people have spoken. I would say when I was there, I don't want to exaggerate, 10 to 20% were inclined to agree with me. Most people were trying to figure out how can and then there was 70% in the middle that were trying to figure out how can we tame this thing. And then there was the other percentage. All the people have spoken, we have to do what the people want. And of course, my wife didn't buy that theory in the family, but anyway, they do. And so I would say it's in there. And I find it sort of interesting this time. I think it's in the House and the Senate. 38 members in the House, and I forget how many in the Senate, have not funded, but signed a bill to say at least if you're going to raise something, you have to provide the taxes for it. And I don't think that's an unreasonable request, but it tells me the system isn't working because more and more people are getting uncomfortable with it. Thank you.
Well, Ken mentions a couple of things. He talks about the U.S. Constitution, and he says, well, you must be disappointed because it's not a U.S. Constitution. Not really. Our founding fathers enumerated the powers of the federal government. They intended it to be very limited, and they guaranteed what was called a Republican form of government. They delegated all other powers to the states and to the people. And it's been tested 3 times that's relevant to us. This question is initiatives contrary to the U.S. Constitution and this guarantee of a Republican form of government. Twice here in the state of Washington, once in the U.S. Supreme Court. And in all 3 cases, they were kicked out of the court saying it was non-judiciable, meaning that it was not a question for the courts. It was a policy question. This is not a constitutional legal question, and no, I'm not disappointed that it's not in the U.S. Constitution. I'm very encouraged that a majority of the states, in fact 26 states, have the power of initiative. And I think it's important to those states in their Republican form of government to maintain and restrain government in some very important ways, in laws that the legislature won't normally pass. Does the legislature like the power of initiative? I would say no. In fact, there's a bill in the legislature right now that tries to gut the citizen initiative. It tries to give all the power and all the decision-making to one person, the Attorney General, with collaboration with the Secretary of State. The king, that would be the king. And that's what we rebelled against. That's what we came away from. We don't want to be the king. Although some legislators, after they've been in the legislature for a number of time, think that you should go to them, that they should be the ones that make the law, that you elected them, that they have been endowed as the people with the rights to make the laws, and the citizens shouldn't have any kind of a say in that. I disagree, and so does the power of initiative that maintains the restraint on government here in the state of Washington. I think when you go to the legislature, if you watch the legislature enough, you realize there is a hierarchy in the legislature. A freshman legislature doesn't have near the power as the Speaker of the House or somebody on the judiciary. Those people wield lots of power. And the power of citizen initiative brings your average taxpayer, it makes them equal across the board with everybody during that time of period. Everybody has a chance to vote on that particular idea. They're very, very difficult to take. There's a number of hurdles you must cross. You must get 250,000 signatures and people that support your ideas. You then go through a public rectal exam of debate, millions of dollars poured into campaigns debating both sides of these issues. And then lastly, you must get 50% plus one of the people to vote yes for your idea in order for it to pass. Even at that, in the first 2 years, the legislature has input on citizen initiatives. They can overturn, they can monkey with it with a 2/3 vote of the legislature, and after 2 years, they can modify it with a simple majority. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. The next question is, when citizens make laws, do you believe that it ties the hand of our legislative bodies? Sorry,
I get to keep talking. This is awesome.
Filibuster.
Does it tie the hands of our legislative bodies? It's interesting that you say that. The power of initiative has been in place since 1912. Over 100 years now, 102 years. And we have passed 74 laws by citizen initiative, 74. If each law was an inch, and an inch is about this, between those two knuckles, that's about 1 inch. That would be 74 inches. That would be 2 inches shorter than I am. That would be 6'2". There were 25 in the same time period, laws approved by the legislature. There were 25,000 laws passed by the legislature. 74 by initiative, 25,000 by the legislature. I'm 6'4", that represents the initiatives. How tall is 25,000 inches? Taller than the Trade Center. I guess they call it Tower 1 now, which is 1,776 feet. 25,000 inches is about 2,000 feet, so it'd be 300 feet taller than the World Trade Center. To think that the 74 ideas passed by citizen initiative somehow unduly ties the hands of our legislature, I don't think so. It wasn't the 74 initiatives that have caused our legislature to start running over budget. You can look back on our big spenders report back there, and we have a list of all the legislator and all the spending ideas that the legislature has. And spending is going up like this as the population is maintaining a gradual increase. It was those ideas, the legislators' ideas, that are increasing the cost and expanding our government and impeding on our individual rights. And it's the power of citizen initiative that is restraining them. Thank you.
Okay. In that inch, and I'm just thinking a little bit right now, when 695 passed, the legislature hasn't been able to really fund the ferry system adequately anymore. And we can't build the ferries, we've raised the fees, done everything else. So maybe that's a more significant inch than the 25,000, rather than, say, give an example, the liquor board can take credit cards. You know, most people don't even notice what that's about. And then, you know, and then of course the other thing I say is, it's like my wife wouldn't put up with this system. But then the other thing I want to say is, and Tim Mine is a classic example, and I have a friend that used to work in the code revisor's office. You can ask for initiative for $5, and they have to do it. That's right. I'm not $5, and then you tell them what you want. Alan's agreeing with me. He worked there. And so then he comes in and he wants an initiative, and he drafts it 1 year. My friend did it for him, or cleans. And then he turns around and it gets declared unconstitutional because they had more than one subject in the bill. And then the next year he comes back and he wants the same initiative. And my friend says, well, if you draft it this way instead of that way, it's constitutional. And he said, no, I don't want it that way. I want it my way. Well, because he's getting paid to pass that initiative. He makes more than any legislator. I think 1 year he was making $250,000. And you'd rather have a guy in Edmonds proposing legislation that might pass or might not pass versus people that have to be responsible to you. And I can tell you this, if I didn't vote for something that like 6 and a 5 and I just picked it out of the air, you know, I get beaten 2 years. You know what happens then? Whoever replaces me wants to reduce the motor vehicle excise tax. Is that democracy? Is that a republic?
Thank you both for your comments. The next question that we have is, do people have a financial influence in the initiative process? So we'll turn to you for the response.
Well, like I pointed out, once the Supreme Court decided that you could pay signature gatherers, I would say the rich have a lot of influence. I would say the average person in here doesn't. And I can't even imagine pick anything you want to pick up. And I'm the same way as you are. If I said, okay, they're going to do this, and it's going to hurt me, am I going to contribute $500 to beat it? No. And the other side puts millions in, and it passes, and I'm vaguely unhappy. And so I would say that general public, after that Supreme Court decision, general public doesn't have the influence. And in fact, when they made that decision, they actually said that they didn't understand. Some of their justices said, we don't understand why you use that system, but if you do, this is the way it's got to be.
Well, there's a couple things I thought I should follow up on. Kim talked about the car tabs initiative I-695 and how that had impacted funding of the ferry system. And you know, legislators like to go around and talk about how a pet project is lacking funds, but it's not because of a particular citizen initiative. It's because the legislature's own inability to prioritize their own spending. There's not a tax the legislature doesn't like. There's not a program the legislature doesn't think needs to be funded, and they have an absolute inability of prioritizing how those funds are spent. They generally spend them in an upside down method. In other words, they fund the lowest priority things first and the highest priority things last, so they can come to you and cry about how they don't have enough money to spend on the highest priority items. I would agree. I think the initiative process has become very expensive. The initiatives were put in place in 1912, and the standards for signature gathering, it takes 8% of the last gubernatorial election is the standard. Now that ends up being about 250,000 votes. And the timeline hasn't changed. It still takes you the same amount of time to gather the signatures. You have to turn your signatures in 4 months before an election, and you take out some of the first process. You end up with about 6 months to gather those 250,000 signatures. And the reality of it is that you probably do have to pay some signature gatherers to get those signatures. It would be virtually impossible to do it purely by a volunteer process. And that does open the door for some wealthy people to insert their influence in the process. But you still have to get 250,000 people to support your idea. You still go through a public rectal exam on that particular idea as it goes on the ballot in a debate. And you still have to get 50% plus one of the people to vote for that idea. Huge hurdles. And the legislature can still overturn it with a 2/3 vote in the first 2 years, and it's after that with a simple majority. There's lots of checks and balances placed in this system. I would submit that we should either lower the threshold for signatures if you want to remove the influence of rich people out of the process, or lengthen the time to gather signatures so that you can do it by a volunteer effort. Those would be two good ideas of reform into the initiative process.
Great, and that leads really well into the closing statement and the question that sort of surrounds this closing statement. So, in summarizing your argument, we'd also like you to address what would you do to change the INR process. So, because Ken spoke first. In the introduction, we'll be fair and allow you to make the first closing statement.
Okay, I get to keep talking. I like this. Well, I believe strongly in the power of initiative and involvement from citizens in the legislature. You know, you could go down to the legislature and you could testify. And if you go to some of those committee hearings, you might see 5 or 6 people that give their testimony in front of the legislature. You could take a poll. A large sampling from a poll would be maybe 500 people. That would be a fairly large poll. Or you could put an item on the ballot by citizen initiative, and you could have 3 million people weighing in on that idea. It's a super lobbying way of the legislature. In fact, the legislature can ignore the ideas of the citizen initiative. You saw the classroom size initiative passed here this last year. The OFM, the Office of Financial Management, said there was a fiscal note of about $4.5 billion to pay for that, and the voters still approved it. But you're seeing now the legislature thinking of ways to basically ignore that idea. I don't think they will fully fund it. In fact, they may get a 2/3 vote to overturn that idea. You cannot force the legislature to do something, but the message is loud and clear. We want to fund education first. And I don't see a conflict between initiatives that reduce taxes and initiatives that say we want more funding to education. We're simply saying we want government to be more efficient with the money that they get. We want to give them less money. And the money that you do have, prioritize your spending and be more efficient with it. I don't see a conflict in those ideas, like I didn't see a conflict in Referendum 49 and I-695. The power of initiative is indeed alive and well. I would make substantive changes to it. These two, I would lower the threshold. States that have the power of initiative, they range between 4% signature gathering threshold and 15% where it 8. I would move it down to 4 or 5%. And I would lengthen the time you could gather signatures to take out any special interest, because the power of initiative was originally lobbied by the Grange to neutralize what they perceived to be special interests influencing the legislature. I think the power of initiative is the one idea that we have that is the most pure expression of our form of government. Yes, we guarantee a Republican form of government from our U.S. Constitution, but fundamentally, a just government derives its power from the consent of the governed. And that holding on to the reins by mechanisms like citizen initiatives are the most fundamental piece of that Republican form of government. With that, I think we should all go out and run some citizen initiatives, take your ideas out to the people, and get them on the ballot, and have as many as 3 million people weigh in on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I took the purest position. I'm a Republican. I don't think we need to maintain the system. But the second thing I found sort of interesting, and I was thinking about it, before we had the Constitution, we were a confederacy, and it didn't work. And they had a constitutional convention. Nobody got everything they wanted out of it. But they said, we have to have a better way to govern ourselves, because otherwise we're going to be a pitiful and weak 13 colonies. And they came together, and the South gave up this, the big states gave up that, the county slaves, and so on. But anyway, they came out of that with the Union. I say in this state now, you couldn't get a constitutional convention, because everybody likes what they get out of the system. They don't like the other things. If you want to raise the minimum wage, well, labor loves that. But if you want right to vote, right to work, the business loves that. And so I'm just saying, why can't we have a long discussion about what's a better decision-making model? And I can tell you, poli-sci professors at the U look at the system and say, it's a poor way to run a government. Now, I served on co-op boards, and they're not far off this. And I was on the board, you gotta make money, do all this. What if we had an initiative by the members saying, we don't want any price increases? Okay. And then the next year they turn around and say, oh yeah, you're not paying the help enough. Okay. We'd go bankrupt. There has to be some responsibility in the system. And you can talk about lowering the number of signatures or anything. I bet there isn't one person here that's going to take up this challenge and go out and start an initiative tomorrow. I bet. And if you do, you get all your signatures, good for you, without paying for them. And then the people will vote on them. And then you're not going to have an ad campaign where the other side will. If you're going to gore somebody's ox, they're going to spend money against you. And this is a debate. This is a civic debate. We know more about deflated footballs than we do about what Congress is doing right now. And then I lived in a country that didn't have this, and I call it a democracy, New Zealand. Down there at the end of that term, did you like what the majority party did or didn't you? If you didn't, you done vote for them. Simple discussion. And then there's a thing to remember about consumer choice. If you get more than 12 options on something, there's always vague dissatisfaction. I should have maybe taken a different option. We have so many initiatives and referendums now that the average individual is overwhelmed. And they don't go. They don't go and vote, they don't do it. They just say, I can't keep up with it all. And legislators, we're on committees. We don't look at every bill in the place. And then I've got a notorious reputation for introducing a lot more bills. A constituent came to me, and the joke was, and I didn't always do this, if I said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, let's put it on the table. Then I got criticized for introducing too many bills. And you're not, good luck on your initiative. I don't think it's going to happen by anybody in this room.
Well, thank you both for a great debate. I think we give them a round of applause for their debate. And before we finish up, and keeping with the spirit of the topic, we will hear from the people in the room who might have questions for the debaters. So, anybody have a question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Alan Hayward, and I did spend 34 years with the state legislature. I wanted to talk about Initiative 695, which was the pinata here. You may recall that a King County Superior Court judge, right off the bat, ruled that it was unconstitutional. Before the ink dried on that opinion, before it ever got to Supreme Court for appeal, a Democrat Senate, a Republican House, and a Democrat governor actually passed 695. So when people blame the people or Tim Hyman, if we are actually going to say it is the wise legislators and the wise system, it's good to remember that it was the wise legislators and the wise system that passed the content of the $30.
Well, I'm in a pretty good position. I was one of the 7 senators that voted against repealing it. And I can remember the conversation, if you don't vote for this, you're not getting reelected.
But
And then they turn around the next week, oh, we got a different problem. So they have the same failings as the voters. But if we stood our ground, I would argue, if we'd have gone along, if we'd done it in 2 years, nobody'd be thinking about that. They'd be thinking about something else. People are more inclined, what's the problem right now? And 2 years anyway, and the noble thing I think was to stand your ground and say, this is bad public policy. And they did.
I'm glad you brought up the point that the legislature actually was the one who passed that law. And I think it's important because it's a point that I made briefly, but I can draw a little finer point to it, that I think the power of citizen initiative is a super lobbying idea, because the legislature, if you're a legislator and your motive is to be reelected, and 3 million people come up and say, we like this idea, that's the best poll that you can get. It's better than the 5 people that show up to the committee or the 500 people that you can get in a big poll sample. And if you're the legislature, you have to decide if you want to listen to that or not. So I think it was good that the legislature did finally bring that, pass it into law.
Do you have any other questions? Yeah.
To what extent is the initiative process viable in counties and cities?
I happen to be very familiar with the local initiative laws. The state initiatives that we've been talking about here all tonight are constitutional. They're in Article 2, the first part of Article 2 of the legislative powers in the Constitution. The local initiative laws are in Chapter 36 of the RCWs. They're statutory. And they have largely been gutted. Local initiative laws, because there's essentially 2 tests in order to exercise the power of local initiatives. The first test is it administrative or legislative? And the second test, is it legislative power that's been granted directly to the municipality or to the legislative body of that city or county? And the case law that shades those 2 questions of test range from the entire spectrum. And so if a city wants to block them on either of those 2 tests, they can find a judge that will most likely rule in their favor to block those ideas.
The only thing I would say, and I'm not a big fan of the whole thing, but if your local council or whatever made a decision you didn't like on an initiative or referendum, why re-elect them?
Other questions? Yeah.
I think I read in the newspaper that Tim Eyman has already begun to sponsor something like 17 initiatives. So is that good government, or is that just obnoxious behavior?
I don't know. I mean, Tim has, eventually he's gotten 4 of his ideas passed into law into the legislature. This power is available to any citizen. Tim Eyman, to you. If you have a great idea and you want to go start it, you're free to do that. That's how our laws work. I think Tim is a very passionate person. He is very passionate about limiting the government, especially in fiscal responsibility and taxation. Seems to his ideas. But if you have your ideas, you are free, as he is, to start an initiative, petition, and gather signatures and get them on the ballot.
Okay, I think Benjamin Franklin was one of our founding fathers. Anyway, a quote by him: "When the people find they can vote themselves money, that will be the herald the end of the republic."
Yeah, other questions? Yeah?
What type of controls exist on initiative and referendum processes when it comes to collecting signatures for them?
There's a whole body of law around the signature gathering. It's essentially, do you have any you want to narrow that question off?
For example, are there any restrictions considering for hiring people to actually collect the signatures for you, or do you simply, is it if you can assemble 250,000 signatures, then they will examine it?
Yeah, in the case right now, no, there are states that have limited that. They have limited the ability of paying per signature. So you can pay a signature gatherer, but you cannot pay them per signature. But the essential limitations in Washington, the signature gathering has to happen in a public forum. Those are the general rule.
Okay. Yes?
One thing I was going to ask about is when you say that it's affordable because now you can pay people to gather signatures and that's going to bring in a lot of money, doesn't it actually simply democratize the system a little bit? Because before that was the case, the people that had the best access to getting an initiative or a referendum on the ballot were the ones that either had the connections necessary to the major publications to get the paper pushing it and the editorial board pushing it, and have the best, maybe fundraising dollars, because certainly they could put ads in the newspapers, as Bruce Helm did back in 1973, blanketed the state with newspapers that had his referendum on the pay raise in the newspaper and said, send this back. And that's how he, instead of paying individual signatures people, he had enough money to raise enough money to stick them all in the papers. If he had more, he would have had U.S. postmen paying for him to be the signature gatherer. If you have enough money, you can send an address envelope to every registered voter in the state of Washington saying, I have had so much money I didn't know what else to do with it, so I'm sending this to you. Please fill it out and send it back in the marked envelope.
Okay, well, I was cooking in a restaurant at that time, and I'm sure I signed on to it. I know I did. In fact, I was outraged like everybody else because it happened at midnight on the last day of the session, and thinking that those days they covered the clock too, so it was after midnight. But anyway, so I signed up. And that one, and I'd say 695 are 2 examples where if you put your finger on an issue that the public feels very strongly about, you don't need to go get all the signatures. But if and I'm just picking the inheritance tax or the classroom school size, most of us aren't that fired up about it. And we're not going to do anything except it gets on the ballot and you go in and read 40 words and you make a decision, yes or no. I found it very interesting. My wife was a teacher on this classroom reduction initiative. If you read the fine print and you run the numbers out, it would add 9,000 teachers, 11,000 gardeners, and they had ratios all the way down to the bottom. And then, and I'm in Seattle. Who's going to build the building to put all those extra teachers in? Are the kids going to be in smaller classrooms, or we're going to put partitions up? That was never answered. We want smaller classroom size. I get that. But we don't want the taxes increased. I get that too. So then we're in a quandary. And we have to work it out together. There's no simplistic answers.
We're largely picking on a process that has brought into law 74 laws since 1912. And we have brought some very good ideas that have restrained government, like disclosure laws, public records laws, salary limits on legislators, performance audits, tax limitations, charter schools, class size, liquor, pornography, marijuana, minimum wage even, and the right to die, assisted suicide. Weighty issues that the legislature won't consider on their own. I think it's important that the citizens maintain control of this initiatives and maintain the reins of the government.
Yeah.
So this question is for you, although you can answer it. I think we could probably guess what you would answer. If you were approached by someone with a petition for an initiative or a referendum that you really believed in and you were really supportive of, would you sign it?
No, I've come around to realizing what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if I have a principle, and then if I think it should be changed, I would go to Olympia and work on the bill and stuff.
Great. Yeah.
I would sign it. If I liked it. I'd like to expand just a little bit on that idea, I guess, is the one thing I really like about citizen initiatives is that idea stays the same from the beginning to the end. So I can read that text of the initiative today, and a year later, it remains the same. The sausage factory of the legislature in Olympia, those laws and those bill ideas can change at a whim. In a committee, and amendments, and on the floor, and amendments. It sounds like it's this real pretty exercise, but it's not. In fact, the bill sponsor may not recognize his own bill by the time it gets out at the end. What I like about it is it stays the same, and it goes through an immense amount of scrutiny. The legislature would never have that amount of scrutiny on any of the bills that they have passed.
I gotta say something right there. You know, when you're on a committee and you introduce a bill, I'm on one side, the staff on the other side reading every bill, the lobbyists are reading the bill, and they're all coming in with comments. The Seattle Times is reading the bill, and sometimes, I'll give you a simple little example from a few years ago because I can't change it. Well, whether you like the trapping initiative or not, I was on one side of it. I didn't think it was a good idea, but anyway, we're debating the other side. And we kept saying that if you do this, you can't trap moles in your yard. If you do this, you can't do this and this and this. And the other side stoutly denied it. And I chaired the Natural Resources Committee. Then after the session started, they came down saying, we need to amend this bill. And I said, why? It's your bill? And they said, oh, the homeowner can't trap moles. And when we were in the debates, they said that didn't apply. Once you lock in on something, in our system, you start out in committee, you end up on the floor, you got to go to the other house, and the same process repeats itself. So it's scrutinized and scrutinized and scrutinized. Then in the end, the governor has an item of veto, and if somebody discovers there's a real turd in there, it can still be vetoed. But if it's voted, if it's out to the people, you got to just bluff your way through the thing, because you can't amend. You can't amend the initiative referendum in mid-flight. It's a very sophisticated system we developed that goes back to 1100 AD, or even earlier, the English Parliament. And we're looking for, and this evolved, parliamentary systems, and now we decide all the people out there. And I can tell you right now, the Polish government, they had a deal where any member of their parliament could vote no on a bill and didn't pass. Poland ceased to exist. The Russians, the Germans, and the Austrians took it over. History's littered with examples of too much democracy.
Whoa.
And I'm talking about a Republican system. We need that. It's a good system. And we don't practice it anymore. We're lucky we're in a rich society so we can screw around with this stuff.
Yeah, in the back.
I have something to say, just because some of the stuff I've heard, honestly, excuse my language, is BS.
Like what?
This woman just asked you, she took something to you, and if you would sign it, if you believed it, you said no. That's the problem. Wait a minute. That's what you said, and that's the problem with a lot of politicians, and that's why people aren't voting for people, because you guys don't do anything, you don't listen to the people who are having issues. People like him are the ones that are trying to help. Your job is just do what we want and protect us and have our voices heard. You guys, the only reason why you pass these rules that aren't straight level is because you have an agenda of your own. And that's what
Hey, look, I got elected by the people in my district. If I had my own agenda, if I'd been a Republican and had my own agenda in the Democratic district, do you think I would have got elected? With my own agenda?
Do we have another question? Yeah, there was one over here. Yes, yes.
I think the billing for this evening referred to both initiatives and referendums.
Right.
Maybe that could be clarified by definition or something, and also, are there any comments about referendums
Good question.
from the two of you?
Well, I guess I'll go first. One is where you can, and I'm putting it real simple right now, initiative comes straight from the people. Referendum is the legislature either decides they want the public to vote on something, or somebody collects enough signatures to get a vote on something. And so that's a referendum. And when I mentioned the pop tax, they went out and got the signatures so the public voted on it after we had passed it. And whether it's right or wrong, but that's the difference in the two. And but if you got the money in the deal and you got a special interest, you can probably get the signatures. So it will be voted on.
There are four styles. There are two styles of referendums, and there are two styles of initiatives. There's referendum bills, where the legislature can vote and send the ideas out to the public for a vote. And there are citizen referendum measures, which if the legislature passes a law, the citizens can pull it back, basically a citizen veto power. And there's a citizen initiative, which largely we've been talking about here, where citizens can go and gather the signatures and get them on the ballot. And there are initiatives to the legislature where citizens can gather signatures but send them to the legislature for their approval or modification. So there's four different styles, but it's the referendum idea. And I think it's important too that citizens maintain a veto power, although the vast majority of the exercise, the most popular form is the citizen initiative of those four, the one that's been used the most. 74 times that we passed into laws versus 25,000 that the legislature has passed.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the senator ever voted for either initiative or a referendum, either as a private citizen or as a legislator.
I'm going to guess fess up. I have a lot of ghosts in my closet. In 1980, the Republicans had put a tax on food. And Jim McDermott was going to run for governor, so he had an initiative to repeal that tax. And I gathered signatures on it. And really where I came around in the beginning, I was a big supporter of the system. I was fine. But then once I started and I got in there, maybe I learned something. And it's not just an ego on my part, but when they said, the Supreme Court said you could pay signature gatherers, it made it incredibly difficult to be a legislator. In fact, I had staff, not my staff, but staff there that are working on the issues, and he said some of the budget instructions by initiatives are so contradictory that they can't even get the staff to understand them, much less a person like me, because they've been accumulating over 10 or 15 years. And so I just said, you know, I hate to say it, but I don't think this is working. And I left a piece back there and I said, why don't we have a constitutional convention and have a good discussion about it? I'm not going to stop there.
So would you support an initiative today that ended initiatives in Washington State?
That's a good question. That's probably the only one I'd vote for. But it wouldn't pass. I know that already. It's dead. I don't even think I don't have to worry about it because you're not going to get the signatures.
Well, I might go out tomorrow and start that up.
Yeah, okay. Been nice knowing you. I'll see you in 20 years.
Anything that you wanted to respond to?
Well, I guess I just mentioned the senator did sponsor a couple of bills in the legislature to end the initiative power, and they were equally as unpopular, I suppose, as you do next year.
But that was my own agenda.
Yeah.
If I could just mention that when the state was formed and they didn't have any initiative powers, all powers were with the legislature, the House and the Senate. When they pulled some back in 1912, they didn't pull them all back. The legislature itself retained some powers that the people simply do not have. And one of them is to propose constitutional amendments. And so, for example, you could draft an initiative if you wanted to change initiative law, referendum law, and you could go out and get signatures, and you could get 99.9% vote if you wanted to, and you would not have changed anything, because the courts consistently ruled that you can't amend the Constitution by initiative. And so it's not within the initiative power to make any changes, whether you want to increase or decrease the numbers, or one thing we really haven't discussed much, and the far better initiative process is the initiative to the legislature. If you want to see something that's complex, that needs to be highly debated in the legislature and in the public, you do the Shoreline Management Act, the MODCA tax, which is the basically environment tax. They were both considered liberal and all that, but they both went through the legislature. Both times the legislature offered alternatives. And the way it works is the public then either takes the public's initiative to the legislature, or they take the legislative alternative. In the case of Shoreline Management Act, they took the legislative alternative. They thought it was better drafted. In the case of the MODCA tax, they took the original initiative over the legislature's alternative. Far more complex, far more difficult, far more investigated and intensely investigated. And nobody wants to use it because it's tough. It's mentally tough. It's physically challenging to go through that process. And so it's by far the best, and it's the least used because it's tough.
Oh, and then I'll give you an example of how the world works. I had a friend of mine that was a lobbyist, and when that MODCA went through, which is a tax on pollutants, putting it real simple, he read A and B, and Boeing wanted B, which the legislature did. And A, he looked at the 40 words at the top and said, put it real simple, should Boeing pay more than I do? And you have to answer that question. He said, people are going to say, Boeing can pay more than I do.
Yeah, I think there are, just as there are checks and balances on our legislative power, you can vote the people out of office. You have to get it passed by both houses. There's veto power from the governor. There's a referendum idea. There are also checks and balances on the citizen initiatives. Signature gathering, 50+1 vote. The legislature has a 2/3. They can change it with a 2/3 vote in the first 2 years, and they can monkey with it with a simple majority after that. there are plenty of opportunities to make sure that, and they have access to the courts. There are plenty of opportunities to monkey with initiatives after they are approved on the ballot.
After they're passed, not before.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up that, and that was going to be my question to the senator. If initiatives are so bad, I mean, what's your stance on just amending them once they're passed if they're going to be so devastating to the budget or whatever's happening? Don't you have the power to stop it right there?
Yeah, and I always voted, if we need to come to a common sense decision, I voted for what I thought was right. Then I turn around and go home and say, why'd you amend this initiative? And I said, well, I didn't think this part was going to work. And then it's your judgment, was I right or wrong?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. So, yeah.
There's been a lot spoken about kind of this cronyism in terms of paid signature gatherers and big companies coming in and influencing the vote and that sort of thing. And I would ask the senator if he can compare that to what I see in the legislature where I see high-paid lobbyists coming in representing coalitions and companies. And
I couldn't quite hear that part of the question.
where I guess I would ask you to compare when in the legislature, where I've been, when you have high-paid, six-figure income lobbyists coming in and representing coalitions and donating to campaigns and essentially influencing unduly, because they have an agenda, the legislative process. I would say that's the same accusation about cronyism and that sort of thing that you've leveled against the initiative process can also be exposed in the legislature, and I would like you to speak to that.
Well, I have a little article back there about Supreme Court decisions, and I mentioned three things, and two relate to this. You can put your money into the Supreme Court campaign now, and that's going to shift that. And what I would argue is with that Supreme Court decision, the special interest captured the initiative system too. So they have the legislature and they have the initiative system. If one doesn't work, they go the other way.
The power
and I'm for campaign finance reform, by the way.
The Power Initiative was brought in because there was a thought that there was undue influence from lobby and special interest. It was brought by the Grange because they thought the railroad and other interests were controlling the legislature. And it brought ideas like, if you're worried about undue influence of lobbying, it brought disclosure laws, which requires lobbyists to report their expenses to the legislature. It brought campaign finance disclosure, which otherwise wouldn't have been restricted. It brought the ideas of these ideas of good government and restraint.
Okay. Thank you. And again, let's thank the debaters here tonight. I think this was a really good example of what a civil debate ought to look like. So very informative debate, and we thank them both for their time. Again, as was mentioned before, if you enjoy debates like this, then you should consider donating. I believe there's the ability to donate to the club in the back there, so you might consider doing that on your way out. So thank you, and have a good evening.